Imagine standing in a small wooden chapel in the heart of North Carolina, the year 1839. The candles flicker against the damp walls, shadows stretching longer than they should. Outside, the trees sway, whispering secrets to the wind. Inside, the townsfolk whisper too, but not in prayer. Their words are sharper, heavier. They speak of sin, of scandal, of something so unnatural it must surely invite the wrath of God. The story begins with two women, not just sisters but twins, identical in face, divided in soul. One tender, her eyes soft as the morning mist. The other stern, her gaze sharp enough to cut through silence. They were bound from birth, inseparable mirrors of one another. And yet, fate twisted their lives into something that blurred the line between devotion and damnation. For in that small, God-fearing town, the two sisters did what no preacher, no father, no neighbor could ever approve of. They gave themselves to one man. They shared him, as husband, as lover, as anchor to a life they were never meant to have. But here is where the true horror lies. From this strange union, only one child would live. The others, swallowed by the silence of the grave before their voices could ever be heard. And so, a haunting question lingers. Was this tragedy born of forbidden love, or was it the curse of blood shared too closely? The tale of these twin sisters is not a love story. It is a shadowed account of desire, jealousy, superstition, and loss. It is a reminder that history does not only record kings and wars, but also the whispers of families who dare to defy the order of their time. Think of it. Two sisters, one husband, and a child who carried the weight of their sins on fragile shoulders. The town did not forget. Even generations later, the name of that family was spoken with unease, as if their misfortune had stained the very soil. Tonight, we unearth that story. We step back into the year 1839, where faith ruled every household, where suspicion governed every glance, and where a pair of women would ignite the kind of scandal that neighbors whispered about until their dying breath. Ask yourself, what force could drive two sisters to share not only their blood, but their husband? Was it desperation, poverty, or something darker? An unholy bond that refused to be broken even by morality itself? The answer may never be clear, but the aftermath, the tragedy, the pain, the whispered curses, is written into the memory of that town, carved like names into an unmarked gravestone. So listen closely, for this story will not give you comfort. It will not offer redemption. Instead, it will lead you through the silence of empty cradles, through the cries of neighbors who claim to see the devil's hand in everything, through the quiet tears of a husband torn between duty and desire. The year is 1839. The place is North Carolina, and the shadows of two sisters still linger there. One child lived, the rest did not, and the whispers have never stopped. Before we can understand the tragedy of the twin sisters, we must step into the world that shaped them. North Carolina, 1839. A land of shadows and contrasts. The countryside stretched wide and endless, with rolling fields of corn and tobacco whispering in the wind. Wooden fences leaned with age, and dirt roads cut through thick forests where the sun often struggled to break through. There was beauty in this land, yes, but there was also a quiet menace. Nights fell heavier here. The trees groaned in storms, and travelers spoke of strange sounds in the dark. It was the kind of place where silence itself could feel like a warning. Life was hard, and death was never far. Families prayed for good harvests, yet watched disease steal their children in the night. The people were bound to the land, to their faith, and to their fear. Superstition ruled nearly as strongly as scripture. Every crow that perched on a fence was seen as a sign. Every child born with a mark upon its skin was whispered about in secret. And twins? Twins carried their own special burden. In those days, twins were a mystery that unsettled the soul. Some said they were a blessing, two souls bound by God himself. Others muttered they were an omen, a doubling of fate that the devil could twist to his liking. To be a twin in 1839 was to walk always under the weight of judgment. The towns of North Carolina were small, scattered, and tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone. A scandal in one house could quickly spread through every kitchen, every porch, every pew in the church. And the church, oh, it ruled more than just the Sabbath. It judged, it punished, it whispered the will of heaven into the ears of frightened men and women. To cross its unspoken laws was to invite ruin. This was the soil in which the sisters grew. Their family tilled their land with weary hands. Their father bowed low from years of toil. Their mother clung to her faith as storms battered their farm and sickness claimed neighbors. Each day was survival, but each night was haunted by stories of curses, of witches, of those who defied God and were punished. It was in this climate that the twins came into the world. The midwife crossed herself when she saw them, identical as mirrors, and the neighbors whispered that such a birth was not natural. Already, before they could take their first steps, the weight of suspicion hung over them. By the time they were young women, the land itself seemed to reflect their lives. Summers brought unbearable heat that cracked the ground and withered crops. Winters froze the fields, leaving families to huddle by firelight, praying that food would last until spring. Poverty pressed hard on everyone, but harder still on women, who were expected to marry for survival as much as love. The community was bound by invisible chains, the fear of poverty, the authority of Scripture, and the ever-present shadow of death. To live in 1839, North Carolina was to walk a narrow path, and any step beyond it could brand you forever. And so when the twins came of age, their bond was already viewed with suspicion. They walked together, spoke in unison at times, and shared secrets that no outsider could understand. To the townsfolk, this closeness was unsettling, unnatural. And when the day came that one man entered their lives, changing everything, the whispers grew louder. For in a land ruled by superstition and fear, nothing seemed more dangerous than love that defied tradition. This was the world of the twin sisters. A world where faith was iron, fear was constant, and scandal could destroy a family. Their choices were made not only in the silence of their hearts, but in the shadow of a community ready to condemn them. And within this harsh land, their story, strange, haunting, unforgettable, began to unfold. They entered this world together, their first cries echoing through a cramped farmhouse on a storm-swept night. The midwife, pale and trembling, muttered prayers under her breath as she delivered them. Identical, perfect mirrors, two sets of eyes opening at once, staring with uncanny similarity. To their mother, they were blessings from God. To their neighbors, they were a warning. From the earliest days, the sisters were inseparable. They moved like shadows of one another, one always a step behind the other, one always finishing the other's thought. To outsiders, it was unsettling. To their parents, it was simply the way things were. When one cried in the night, the other stirred awake as if she had felt the sorrow herself. When one grew sick, the other paled and weakened as though illness was shared between them. It was as though they were bound by more than blood, bound by something invisible, unexplainable. As little girls, they would wander barefoot through the woods, their hands clasped together, whispering secrets no one else could hear. They speak in a language of their own, an old neighbor once said. Mark my words, those two carry something unnatural. In a time when superstition was stronger than reason, such words took root quickly. The townsfolk began to watch them, not with curiosity but with suspicion. Folklore painted twins in many lights. Some believed they brought prosperity, that one twin carried luck, while the other carried wisdom. But in whispers, darker tales were told, of twins cursed to live half-lives, where one would know happiness only through the suffering of the other. Of twins bound so closely that love itself, when it came, would twist into something destructive. The sisters themselves seemed unbothered. As they grew into young women, they leaned into their bond, treating it as something sacred. They wore their hair the same way, dressed alike when they could, and laughed at the way people stared. But though they were mirrors, subtle differences soon revealed themselves. The first sister, whose smile was soft and whose hands lingered kindly upon others, was gentle at heart. She was known to bring food to the poor, to hum hymns as she worked, to calm the younger children in church when the sermons grew too long. Her eyes carried warmth, as though she saw light where others saw only shadow. The second sister was different. Her words were fewer, sharper. She carried herself with a strength that unsettled men and women alike. Her eyes were not soft but piercing, eyes that seemed to know too much, to see through the polite lies people told. She was not unkind, but she was not easily approached. Where her sister bent, she stood firm. Where her sister forgave, she remembered. It was this contrast, perhaps, that made them so compelling together. Two halves of one whole, kindness and strength, tenderness and severity. Yet despite their differences, they could not bear separation. When one lingered by the riverbank, the other would come soon after. When one stayed inside, the other sat beside her. Always together, always bound. The people of the town watched unsettled. Some whispered admiration, that such loyalty was rare, that such devotion was beautiful. But others murmured that it was unnatural. No woman should belong so wholly to another, they said. What will become of them when a man enters their lives? Who will they choose? Or worse, what if they both choose the same one? In those words lay prophecy. For love was inevitable, but love between sisters could not remain untouched by the world outside. Still, before that day came, their bond deepened further. There were stories, unproven yet told all the same, that the sisters shared dreams. That in the stillness of night, one would wake from a vision and describe it, only for the other to whisper, "I saw it too." Some even claimed they could feel each other's pain. Once, when the gentler sister cut her hand on a shard of glass, her twin flinched across the room, blood rushing to her face as though she herself had been wounded. Perhaps these were exaggerations. Or perhaps they were truth the world was not ready to understand. But in 1839, North Carolina, such mysteries were not met with wonder. They were met with fear, and fear turned quickly to gossip. By the time they reached the edge of womanhood, the sisters were already legends in their small town. Not for deeds of greatness, but for the strangeness of their existence. Two bodies, one soul, the old women muttered. God himself will decide which one carries the blessing, and which the curse. It was into this shadow of superstition that a stranger would one day arrive. A man whose presence would test the limits of their bond, and whose choice would set them upon a path of love, jealousy, and tragedy. For even the closest of twins could not remain untouched by desire. And when desire came, it would not come gently. It would come like a storm. The sisters did not know it yet. But the bond that had carried them through childhood, a bond unbreakable in laughter, in sorrow, in silence, would soon be stretched beyond all reason. For there are some things that even blood cannot bind, and some loves that carry the seeds of destruction. And so, as the sisters stood together at the threshold of womanhood, the town whispered of curses, of fate, of inevitable downfall. They were admired, envied, feared, but most of all they were watched. And in every whispered word of doubt, a prophecy took shape. If one sister was to live in happiness, the other would surely fall into despair. The bond of twins is a mystery. To some a gift, to others a curse. For these sisters it was both. The summer of 1839 carried with it more than heat. It carried a stranger. He arrived on horseback, dust clinging to his coat, the sun sinking low behind him. To the townsfolk his appearance seemed almost providential, as though fate had chosen that exact hour to set him on their road. His name was Thomas Gray, a man of middling wealth, with sharp features and a voice that commanded attention. He was not from these parts. His accent carried the lilt of Virginia, his manners the polish of someone raised with a hint more privilege than the farmers of North Carolina could ever claim. Whispers followed him, before he even dismounted. Who was this man? Why had he come? Some said he sought land, others that he sought fortune. But when his eyes first fell upon the twin sisters, those whispers twisted into something far darker. The sisters had seen men before, of course. Suitors had circled them in the past, drawn to their beauty and repelled just as quickly by the strangeness of their bond. None had ever dared to step between them. None had ever dared to imagine they could choose one and not divide the other. But Thomas Gray was not like the others. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he could master whatever stood before him. Land, people, even fate itself. The gentler sister was the first to notice him. She saw in him a strength, a steadiness, something that promised protection against the harshness of their world. Her gaze lingered on him longer than it should have, and when he smiled politely, her heart stirred in ways it never had before. The sterner sister, however, looked at him differently. She did not soften. She studied him as one might study an opponent, weighing his intentions, searching for the shadows beneath his charm. And though she found reasons to distrust him, she too felt something she could not name. Attraction, perhaps, or destiny. It did not take long for Thomas to weave himself into their lives. He visited their farm, offering help with tasks their aging father struggled to manage. He spoke with their mother, winning her trust with carefully chosen words about faith, family, and providence. And when he spoke with the sisters, he did so with an intensity that made them feel, each in her own way, as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. But herein lay the danger. For he did not speak only to one. His gaze shifted between them, his words tailored subtly to each. To the tender sister he spoke of dreams, of building a future together, of children laughing in a warm home. To the stern sister he spoke of strength, of weathering storms, of building a name that would not be forgotten. It was as though he saw them both, wholly and completely. And in that recognition each found herself drawn to him. The town noticed. Neighbors whispered that Thomas Gray had cast a spell over the twins. Mothers pulled their daughters close when he passed. Men muttered that no good could come from such entanglements. And yet, the whispers grew quieter when Thomas offered donations to the church, when he worked the fields alongside others, when he bowed his head in prayer. He was a man who seemed respectable, but respectability can be a mask. For though Thomas spoke of love, of honor, of faith, there was something restless in his eyes. He had come to North Carolina not merely to build a life, but to escape one. Rumors followed him like shadows, of debts left unpaid in Virginia, of a quarrel that ended with a man bloodied on the ground, of promises made to another woman that were never fulfilled. Whether these tales were truth or fabrication, none could say for certain, but the air around him always seemed heavier, as though secrets clung to his very breath. The sisters, blind to such whispers, found themselves ensnared. Each believed she saw in him what the other could not. Each believed her bond with him was unique, unshakable, and Thomas, whether by intention or by weakness, did nothing to sever that illusion. Instead, he allowed it to grow. One night, under a harvest moon, he stood with them by the riverbank. The water shimmered with silver light, and the trees bent low as though listening. He took the hands of both sisters, one in each of his own, and whispered words neither would ever forget. "You are two halves of one soul. To love one is to love the other, and I cannot choose between you." Those words sealed their fate. To the sisters it was a declaration of devotion, proof that their bond could never be broken, not even by love. But to the town, once they discovered what had been spoken, it was blasphemy. A man claiming two wives, two sisters no less. It was unholy, it was unnatural, and it was the beginning of ruin. Thomas Gray, whether he knew it or not, had stepped into a storm, and the twins, bound by blood and now by love, would be swept into it with him. Their bond, once pure and unshakable, was about to be tested in ways neither could have imagined. The arrival of Thomas was not simply the arrival of love. It was the arrival of division, of jealousy, of secrets, and in time of tragedy, for in loving both sisters, he had set them all upon a path that could only end in sorrow. And so the summer of 1839 did not merely bring a stranger. It brought the seed of a story that would haunt North Carolina for generations. It began quietly, like a spark no one noticed. A hushed promise spoken in candlelight, the clasping of hands behind closed doors, the dangerous belief that love could defy law, scripture, and human judgment. But sparks, if left unchecked, always grow into flames. And soon, what Thomas Gray and the twin sisters shared in silence became the scandal that set their town ablaze. The arrangement was simple in form, impossible in consequence. Thomas took both sisters as his wives. No preacher would bless it, no law would recognize it, yet within the confines of their farmhouse vows were spoken. 2 rings, 1 man, 2 brides, 1 husband. It was a union stitched together not by the church, but by desire and defiance. For the sisters, it was more than love. It was survival of the bond that had defined them since birth. Neither could bear to be cast aside. Neither could accept a life where one was chosen and the other left to loneliness. To them, the solution was not scandal, but sacrifice. A sacrifice of tradition, of acceptance, of the world's approval. They would share him, just as they had shared everything since the moment they entered this world. But the town saw it differently. The first whispers came from the church pews. Women in stiff dresses leaned into each other, murmuring as the twins arrived with Thomas, their hands brushing his as if unafraid of being seen. Men shook their heads, muttering that no decent household could endure such shame. The preacher, red-faced and trembling with fury, declared from the pulpit that Sodom has risen among us. Still, Thomas was not cast out immediately. He had wealth enough to silence the poorest farmers with favors and charm enough to disarm those who confronted him. But charm is fleeting. Gossip, however, lingers. The whispers grew louder. Children were pulled away from the sisters when they walked into town. Neighbors stopped knocking on their door. At the market, women crossed themselves when they passed, as though warding off evil. Two sisters sharing one husband, they muttered. It is not love, it is sin, and sin does not go unpunished. Inside their home, the arrangement festered. What the sisters believed to be balance soon revealed itself as imbalance. Jealousy, subtle at first, began to creep into their hearts. Each sought Thomas's attention in different ways. The tender sister through kindness and devotion, the stern sister through strength and defiance. Thomas, caught in the middle, played a dangerous game, promising his love equally, yet favoring one or the other in fleeting moments that did not go unnoticed. The house grew tense with unspoken rivalries. A glance too long at one sister's smile became an insult to the other. A night spent in one bed became a betrayal. The very bond that had once made the sisters inseparable was now poisoned, stretched taut under the weight of their shared desire. The town, too, shifted from whispers to action. Men approached Thomas, warning him that his choices threatened not only his soul, but the peace of their community. Women refused to speak to the sisters, their former friends now treating them as outcasts. The preacher visited their home, slamming his Bible upon the table and demanding that Thomas repent. "You will bring ruin upon this house," he thundered, "and upon the child born of such wickedness." But Thomas, proud and stubborn, would not relent. "I love them both," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "And if God condemns me for that, then let him strike me down himself." No lightning came. No strike of divine punishment silenced him, and so the scandal deepened. Some believed the sisters had bewitched Thomas, ensnaring him with witchcraft. Others whispered that he was the devil himself, using them as instruments of corruption. Children dared each other to walk past the farmhouse at night, claiming to hear strange cries from within, not of love, but of torment. Yet within the home, love and torment were one and the same. For while Thomas spoke of devotion, the sisters began to feel the cost of their arrangement. The gentler sister wept quietly in the night, longing for the simplicity of a love that belonged wholly to her. The sterner sister hardened further, refusing to yield, vowing she would never be cast aside. Between them, Thomas drifted, guilty and restless, unable to choose, unwilling to lose either. The scandal reached its peak one Sunday morning. The sisters arrived at church with Thomas walking proudly between them, each sister holding an arm. The congregation fell into stunned silence. Gasps echoed against the wooden beams. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, and the preacher, trembling with rage, pointed from the pulpit and shouted, "Abomination!" The sisters did not flinch. Thomas did not bow his head. They stood there in defiance of judgment, bound by a love that had become both shield and curse. But defiance has a price, and in that moment, the town's condemnation hardened into something that would never be undone. From that day forward, they were marked, outcasts, unholy, their names spoken in whispers, their home avoided, their lives shadowed by constant suspicion. The arrangement they believed could preserve their bond had instead condemned them to isolation. But worse still, It had set into motion a fate none of them could escape. For within that house, behind shuttered windows and drawn curtains, life was stirring. The sisters would soon carry children, and with their pregnancies came both hope and dread. Hope for new beginnings, dread for what the world would make of such children. The town waited. The preacher preached fire and brimstone. Neighbors prayed for God's judgment, and the sisters prayed too, prayed that the life within them would survive the hatred surrounding them. But fate is not swayed by prayer. And in the months to come, the scandal of their marriage would pale in comparison to the tragedy that followed. The farmhouse was no longer a place of whispers and scandal. It had become a shrine of expectation, a fragile temple where life itself stirred within the twin sisters' wombs. The forbidden arrangement, once the subject of gossip and outrage, now carried a weight far heavier than sin. The promise of children. The world beyond their doors condemned them, but inside, hope flickered like a single candle, trembling yet unextinguished. When the sisters first discovered their condition, their reactions could not have been more different. The gentler sister pressed her trembling hands against her belly, eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. "A child," she whispered. "Our child." Her voice was soft, almost prayerful, as if she believed motherhood might redeem them. To her, the unborn life was not a curse, but salvation, proof that love could yield something pure. The sterner sister, however, stood in silence, her eyes unblinking, her jaw set. Hope did not warm her heart. It hardened her resolve. "This child will be strong," she declared. "It will silence their tongues." Where her sister sought redemption, she sought vindication. She imagined the child as a banner raised against their enemies, a living proof that they could not be broken. Thomas stood between them, bewildered, awed, and secretly afraid. Fatherhood should have been a moment of joy, but for him it was a haunting question: whose child was whose? Which womb bore his heir, and which bore the extension of a scandal? He dared not ask aloud. To do so would be to tear apart the fragile unity they still clung to. The town, however, asked the question with venom. Gossip twisted into accusation. "Two sisters with child," the neighbors spat. "Do they even know whose is whose? Or does the devil himself father both?" At the market, women sneered as the sisters walked with swollen bellies, muttering curses under their breath. Men shook their heads, saying the children would be born cursed, born marked by the sin of their parents. And yet, despite the cruelty of the world outside, within the farmhouse there grew a strange and terrible beauty. The sisters began to dream, not only of children but of futures. The gentle sister stitched tiny garments from scraps of cloth, humming lullabies as she worked, her hands trembling with both love and fear. The stern sister walked the halls at night, whispering to her unborn child promises of strength, protection, and vengeance against those who despised them. But the bond between the sisters, already strained by their shared husband, grew more fragile with every passing day. Pregnancy magnified their differences. The gentle one longed for peace, for unity, for a family untouched by hatred. The stern one longed for triumph, for power, for a child who would inherit not shame but pride. And Thomas, torn between their desires, tried desperately to soothe both. A touch here, a word there, always promising what he could never fully give. At night, the farmhouse echoed with sounds both tender and unsettling. The sisters, restless in their condition, sometimes wept together, clinging to one another as they once had in childhood. Other nights, they quarreled in low, tense voices that carried through the walls. Arguments about whose child would be born first, whose would be stronger, whose would command Thomas's heart. The tension seeped into the air itself, making the house heavy with unspoken fears. The candles seemed to burn lower, the walls closer, the very wood of the house groaning under the weight of their secrets. And then came the preacher. He arrived at their door one grey afternoon, his black cloak soaked with rain, his Bible clutched tight in his hand. The sisters did not want to let him in, but Thomas insisted, hoping perhaps for reconciliation, or at least peace. But peace was not the preacher's gift. "You bring abominations into this world," he spat, his voice echoing through the small parlor. "Children of sin, children of shame, do you think God will bless what is cursed?" No, he will mark them. He will mark you. And when judgment comes, it will not be upon you alone. It will be upon them." The gentle sister wept, begging him to leave. The stern sister rose to her full height, her hand upon her swollen belly, and hissed, "My child will outlive your words. My child will silence you." The preacher left, his eyes blazing with hatred, muttering prayers as though warding off the evil of the house. But his words lingered like poison. That night the sisters could not sleep. Each touch of movement in their bellies felt like both blessing and curse. Hope warred with dread. The months dragged on, heavy and restless. The town grew more hostile. Strangers hurled insults at Thomas in the street. Stones were thrown at the farmhouse windows. The sisters became prisoners within their own home, forced to watch the world only through curtains drawn tight. And yet within them life grew stronger. Their bodies changed, their breathing became heavy, their movements slower. The children were coming. When the labor pains began, they began together. As if bound by something deeper than chance, the sisters cried out within hours of each other, their voices rising in tandem, echoing through the farmhouse like the wails of ghosts. Thomas, frantic and trembling, ran from one room to the other, torn between two births, two wives, two cries of agony. The night of their labor was a storm. Thunder cracked the sky open, rain lashed the windows, and the farmhouse groaned as if the heavens themselves condemned what was happening within. The sisters clutched the sheets, their bodies racked with pain, their faces pale with both terror and determination. At last, as dawn bled across the horizon, the cries of newborns filled the house. 2 children entered the world within hours of each other. One cradled by the gentle sister, her tears falling upon the infant's face as she whispered prayers of gratitude. The other held by the stern sister, her eyes blazing with triumph as she raised the child to her breast. Hope had been born. Yet as Thomas stood between them, staring at the infant swaddled in trembling arms, he felt no peace. Instead, a dread heavier than any before settled upon him. For though the children's cries pierced the storm, another sound seemed to linger beneath, a silence, a weight, a question that could not yet be answered. Whose children were they? And what fate awaited them in a world that despised their very existence? The sisters, exhausted but resolute, believed the births had changed everything. To them, the children were proof that love, however forbidden, however condemned, could triumph. But Thomas, staring into the storm-lit dawn, felt something else entirely. The sense that hope, once born, does not always remain pure. Sometimes hope grows teeth, and sometimes it devours everything. The cries of the newborns had barely faded when the whispers began. In a world already brimming with judgment, the sight of 2 infants born to twin sisters and one husband became fuel for darker talk. What had once been scandal now twisted into something heavier, more terrifying, the sense that the family had brought a curse upon themselves and upon the land. At first, the whispers came in hushed tones, murmured in pews during Sunday service. Women leaned close, their bonnets nearly touching as they hissed behind gloved hands. "Did you hear? Both sisters bore children on the same night. How can that be anything but unnatural?" Men, sitting stiffly in their pews, muttered to one another about omens, about divine punishment, about bloodlines tainted by sin. Then, in the marketplace, the whispers grew bolder. Old women crossed themselves as the sisters' names were spoken. Farmers swore their cattle gave sour milk since the births. A merchant claimed his child had taken ill the very day the infants were born. One superstition bled into another, until soon the entire county seemed to believe the twins' children were not gifts of God, but messengers of darkness. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere shifted. The gentle sister clung desperately to hope, rocking her infant by candlelight, whispering lullabies as though she could sing away the rumors. "They'll see," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll see these children are innocent." Her eyes glistened with conviction, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. The stern sister, in contrast, hardened further. She stood like a sentinel over her child's cradle, glaring at shadows as if daring the world to strike. "Let them whisper," she hissed. Their fear is proof of our power. These children are stronger than their hatred." But her defiance was edged with desperation, for even she could not entirely ignore the sense of something heavy pressing down on them. Thomas bore the worst of it. Men spat at him in the street, muttering words like abomination and sin-bearer. Some even crossed to the other side of the road when he passed, as though his very shadow carried disease. His once proud step grew hesitant. At night, when he returned to the farmhouse, he said little, his silence a shield against despair. But in his eyes, shadows deepened, as though he had begun to wonder whether the whispers were true. The infants themselves became symbols of unease. When neighbors glimpsed them, pale, fragile, their eyes wide and unblinking, the rumors only grew. "They never cry," one woman claimed. "Not like normal children." Another insisted she saw one of the babes stare into the fire, unafraid, as though it understood something far beyond its years. None of these tales were proven, but in a world ruled by superstition, proof mattered little. Soon the word curse took root. People said the land itself bore signs, crops wilting too soon, wolves seen prowling nearer to homes, storms breaking at odd hours. Every misfortune, however small, was laid at the feet of the farmhouse where the sisters lived. And yet, within those walls, life unfolded with fragile tenderness. The gentle sister devoted herself entirely to her child, her lullabies softer than breath, her prayers constant. The stern sister, though harsher in her manner, guarded her infant with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. At night she paced the floors, whispering, "You will not be taken. You will not be broken." But even within the home, cracks widened. The sisters argued more fiercely than ever. The gentle one begged for reconciliation with the town, for baptism, for acceptance through faith. The stern one scoffed, calling the church hypocrites, their faith poisoned by hatred. Thomas, torn between them, grew weary, his face etched with lines of conflict. The children, however, seemed to draw the sisters apart in subtler, more poisonous ways. Each mother looked upon her child as proof of her own righteousness. The gentle one believed her child embodied grace, the stern one believed hers embodied strength. Each feared, though neither would admit it aloud, that one child might be weaker, less favored, less destined. And the unspoken question of paternity lingered like a ghost in every glance, every silence. Then, tragedy struck. One of the infants, pale, fevered, gasping, grew ill. The gentle sister stayed awake for nights, pressing cool cloths to her child's brow, praying, singing lullabies in a voice cracked with desperation. Thomas fetched doctors, but they shook their heads, muttering about weak lungs, about frail beginnings. The stern sister watched in silence, clutching her own child tighter, as though fate might steal hers next. When the fever broke at last, it did not bring relief. The child's tiny body stilled, breath fading into silence. The farmhouse echoed with a scream so raw it seemed to tear the walls apart. The gentle sister's cry as she held her lifeless infant. Thomas fell to his knees, his face buried in his hands. The stern sister stood rigid, her eyes glistening but dry, her grip on her surviving child iron tight. Word spread quickly. The whispers grew louder, more poisonous. "One has already perished," they said. "It is the curse. The curse takes what is weak." Some murmured that more deaths would follow, that no child born of such sin could live long. Others whispered that the family had angered God and only fire could cleanse the land. The gentle sister shattered under the weight of grief. She clutched the small bundle of cloth to her chest long after the body had cooled, rocking back and forth as if she could will life back into her child. Her lullabies turned to wails, her prayers to broken pleas. Hope, which once glowed so brightly in her, guttered into ash. The stern sister, though shaken, grew more rigid. "It is survival," she whispered, gazing at her own infant. "One child was not meant to live. Mine will endure. Mine must endure." Yet behind her fierce words, a tremor lingered in her voice, a fear she could not banish. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed to fracture. He buried the child with trembling hands, his spade cutting into earth made heavy by rain. No words escaped him. No prayers rose from his lips. When he returned to the farmhouse, mud clinging to his boots, He looked at his surviving child not with joy, but with haunted eyes, as though he saw in the infant's face not life, but the shadow of all that had been lost. The farmhouse, once heavy with tension, now drowned in silence. Every creak of the wood, every flicker of candlelight seemed to carry the ghost of the lost child. The gentle sister drifted through the halls like a wraith, her face hollow, her eyes emptied of light. The stern sister kept her child close at all times, as though daring fate to take another. Outside, the whispers turned to warnings. Some spoke of curses, others of witchcraft, and some of divine wrath. The family had become more than scandal. They had become a story, a cautionary tale whispered at firesides and in shadowed corners. Children were warned not to stray near their land. Farmers spoke of moving away, and in the minds of many, the family had crossed a line beyond forgiveness. Within the farmhouse walls, the truth was far more fragile, far more human. Grief, fear, and a single flickering hope. One child left, a life clung to with desperate hands. But to the world beyond, they were already lost, already damned, their legacy stained by whispers of a curse that no prayer could erase. The grave was still fresh when the first stones struck the farmhouse. Small at first, cast by children emboldened by their parents' whispers, but soon larger, heavier, hurled by men whose faces burned with righteous fury. Each rock against the wooden boards was an accusation, a reminder that the town no longer saw the family as neighbors, but as monsters. Inside, silence reigned. The gentle sister sat by the empty cradle, her body hunched forward, her fingers tracing the wood as though she could still feel the warmth of the child she had lost. Her voice, once full of lullabies, now carried only broken murmurs. At night, she sometimes rose and wandered the halls, cradling a bundle of blankets to her chest, whispering songs to air, to absence. The stern sister, though outwardly unyielding, was no less haunted. She clutched her surviving infant to her breast with desperate strength, pacing the floors like a lioness cornered by hunters. Her eyes darted to the windows at every sound outside, her ears attuned to whispers that might have been wind, might have been voices. "They will not take you," she muttered over and over, as though the act of saying it could keep fate itself at bay. And Thomas, the husband, the father, was unraveling. The man who once walked with pride now carried himself as though the earth itself pulled him down. His face grew hollow, his eyes shadowed, and when he spoke his words were clipped, trembling, sometimes incoherent. He drank in secret, pouring whiskey into his cup before dawn, as though to burn away thoughts too heavy to carry. But liquor only deepened his torment. Whispers had followed him for months, but now they grew sharper, darker. In the tavern, men muttered that he had consorted with devils, that no righteous man would share his bed with two sisters. Some claimed the deaths in his house were judgment, others that they were sacrifices, offerings to something unholy. One night, stumbling home in a haze of drink, Thomas heard footsteps behind him. Rough voices followed. "Sin-bearer," one spat. Another said, "Your house will burn before the season ends." He turned, fists clenched, but the men melted into the shadows, leaving only laughter carried on the wind. Thomas stumbled the rest of the way, heart hammering, the weight of unseen eyes pressing in. In the farmhouse, secrets festered. The sisters' once unbreakable bond had fractured beyond repair. The gentle one, consumed by grief, began to resent her sister's surviving child. She never said the words aloud, but in the way her eyes lingered on the infant, sorrowful, hollow, almost accusatory, the truth was plain. The stern sister saw it, and her own heart hardened further. "Do not look at my child that way," she snapped one night, voice like iron. "Your sorrow is not his burden." But the gentle sister could not stop herself. To her, the cries of her sister's child were a cruel reminder of what she had lost. A reminder that one cradle lay empty while another rocked with life. Her prayers turned bitter, her lullabies twisted into laments. Thomas, caught between them, grew more broken by the day. He began to see shadows where none existed, to hear whispers in the corners of rooms. Sometimes he swore the voice of the dead infant called to him from the empty cradle. Other times, he woke in the night drenched in sweat, convinced he had buried the wrong child, that some mistake had doomed them all. The town's hostility sharpened into violence. Windows shattered in the night, stones wrapped in scripture verses hurled through the glass. A barn on the edge of their land caught fire, flames devouring wood as neighbors stood at a distance, murmuring that justice had been done. When Thomas confronted the sheriff, begging for protection, he found only cold eyes. "Keep your sin to yourself," the sheriff said. "The town's had enough of your curse." Inside the house, fear thickened into suffocation. The sisters rarely left, and Thomas only ventured out when necessity demanded. Supplies grew scarce, and the air inside became heavy with smoke, grief, and suspicion. Every cough, every fevered cry from the surviving infant brought panic. It was during one of those fevers that the unspoken dread surfaced. The child, flushed and gasping, seemed on the edge of death. The gentle sister, frantic, leaned over the crib and whispered, Perhaps it is God's will." The words slipped out before she could stop them. The stern sister's hand struck her across the face with the force of fury. "You will not curse my child with your bitterness," she hissed. "You will not wish him dead." Her eyes burned with a fire so sharp the gentle sister recoiled, clutching her cheek, tears streaming silently down her face. From that moment, the rift between them became a chasm. The stern sister guarded her child not only from the world outside, but from the sorrowful eyes of her own twin. The gentle sister, hollowed by grief and guilt, withdrew further into herself, her words fewer, her voice quieter. And Thomas, poor, unraveling Thomas, drifted between them like a ghost. He began to vanish for days, slipping into the woods, into the taverns, into places where no one could follow. When he returned, his clothes stank of liquor and mud, his hands trembling as though he had touched something unspeakable. He spoke little, but when he did, his words chilled the air. "The whispers are true," he muttered once, staring at the fire. "We are cursed. I have seen it in their eyes." The farmhouse became a prison of shadows. Doors creaked when no one moved. The air grew heavy at night, thick with silence broken only by the infant's cries. The gentle sister swore she sometimes heard two cries, one from the cradle and one from the empty one beside it. The stern sister told her to hold her tongue, to stop inviting darkness with her madness. But even she began to glance at shadows longer than before, her grip on her child tightening whenever the wind howled. Rumors outside grew darker still. Some spoke of torches, of cleansing fire. Others claimed the sisters were witches who had bound Thomas in a spell, their children half-blooded things born of sin. A few swore they had seen lights in the windows late at night, shapes moving that could not be explained. Fear fed upon itself until the entire town seemed ready to explode. Within the farmhouse, grief and suspicion gnawed at what little remained of love. Every word spoken carried weight, every glance a wound. Secrets festered, unspoken doubts about paternity, unvoiced fears of curses, unacknowledged resentment over life and death. Shadows grew long across the walls, and in their silence, the family could no longer tell whether the darkness outside was more dangerous than the darkness within. The curse, whether real or imagined, had taken root, and it was no longer just in the whispers of the town. It was in their blood, in their thoughts, in their very souls. The farmhouse stood like a scar on the land, its shutters warped, its roof sagging beneath the weight of storms, its windows broken and patched with boards. What once had been a home now seemed more a mausoleum, a monument to grief and whispered curses. The world outside had turned its back, and within those walls, death and despair crept in like rot. Illness was the first to take hold. The damp of the fields seeped into the floorboards, bringing with it fevers that spread through the house. The gentle sister, already hollowed by grief, fell weak. She coughed blood into her handkerchief at night, hiding it in drawers so her twin would not see. Her once bright face grew gaunt, her eyes sunken with sorrow and sickness. Yet still, she tried to sing, broken lullabies to an absent child, whispers meant to comfort herself more than anyone else. The stern sister hardened further, her body fueled not by health but by sheer will. She rarely slept, pacing the halls, guarding her child against every shadow. But even her strength faltered. She grew thinner, her movements slower, her eyes wild with exhaustion. The fire within her had not gone out, but it burned her from the inside, consuming what little remained. And the child, the one child who had survived, grew up in this house of shadows. He was a quiet boy, pale and watchful, with wide eyes that seemed too knowing for his years. He spoke little, but when he did, his words often startled the sisters. "He's here," he whispered once, pointing to the empty cradle. "He watches me." The gentle sister wept at those words, believing her lost infant lingered near. The stern sister silenced the boy, gripping his shoulders with trembling hands. "Do not speak of ghosts," she hissed. But her own eyes darted to the cradle long after he had gone to sleep. Thomas was scarcely a father at all. The man who had once been the center of their scandal had wasted into something hollow, a figure more ghost than flesh. Drink gnawed at him, sickness of the mind devoured what remained. He spent long nights in the barn or wandering the woods, muttering to himself, his voice ragged, his hands shaking. The boy rarely saw him, and when he did, it was not with love but with unease. His father's eyes no longer carried warmth, only shadows, only guilt. The town's cruelty never relented. No one came to help, no doctor stayed long. When the family sought aid, doors were shut in their faces. Children were warned not to look upon the boy, as though even his shadow carried contagion. And so, the family grew more isolated, bound together not by love but by their exclusion, their shared curse. Seasons turned, and the farmhouse decayed with each passing year. Food grew scarce. The boy grew thin, his ribs showing beneath his shirt. Yet his eyes still watched, still listened, as though recording every cruelty, every silence. The gentle sister clung to him when she could, her frail arms wrapping around him with desperate affection. She whispered prayers into his hair, prayers that he might escape, that he might live where she could not. But her cough worsened, her strength faded, and one bleak winter night, her prayers ceased altogether. Her death was quiet, almost unnoticed. She slipped into sleep and did not wake, her body finally surrendering to grief and sickness. The stern sister found her cold in bed, her face serene in death in a way it had never been in life. For a long while she said nothing. Then, clutching her own child close, she whispered, "One less weakness, one less chain." Yet when she turned away, her eyes glistened with tears she would not let fall. Thomas did not attend the burial. He had vanished into the woods for days, returning with wild eyes and mud-streaked clothes, as though the earth itself had swallowed him and spat him back out. When told of the gentle sister's passing, he only nodded, staring at the floor. The boy, confused and grieving, tried to ask why his father did not weep. Thomas only muttered, "I buried enough already." With one sister gone, the house grew colder. The stern one became more desperate, more severe. She taught her boy to fear the outside world, to mistrust every glance, every voice. "They want you gone," she warned him. "You are all I have left. You must be strong." Her words were armor, but they were also chains, binding the boy to her bitterness. He grew wary, suspicious, his childhood stolen by fear, and still Thomas unraveled. Whispers of madness followed him wherever he went. Some swore he spoke to the air, others that he howled at the moon like a beast. At home, he muttered of curses, of sins that could not be washed away. Sometimes, in drunken stupor, he accused the sisters of binding him in witchcraft. Other times he begged their forgiveness, falling to his knees before their shadows. The boy learned to avoid him, slipping silently away when his father's footsteps staggered through the halls. The collapse was not a sudden fall, but a slow erosion. Each day stripped something from them, health, joy, hope. The stern sister's body weakened, her face hollowing, though her spirit fought on. Thomas sank deeper into madness, until even the boy began to fear him more than the town outside. And the boy himself, pale and silent, became a child of shadows, raised not by laughter and love, but by grief, fear, and whispers of curses that shaped his every thought. By the time he was old enough to understand the truth of his family, the boy had already inherited their shame. The town did not forget. Children mocked him from afar, calling him cursed. Men warned him to keep his distance. Women pulled their children away when he passed. He carried the weight of his family's sins on his thin shoulders, a burden no child should bear, and in the house, the shadows deepened. The stern sister clung to him fiercely, binding him tighter as though he were her final tether to existence. Thomas drifted like a ghost through the halls, half dead even while he breathed. And the gentle sister's absence lingered like a hollow space, her lullabies replaced by silence, her prayers by emptiness. The collapse of the family was nearly complete. All that remained was a boy, the single surviving child, growing in a world that despised him, surrounded by the ruins of those who had birthed him into scandal and shadow. The curse, whether real or imagined, had claimed nearly all, and what it left behind was not salvation, but a legacy of sorrow that clung to the boy like a shroud. The story of the twin sisters and their shared husband did not end with their deaths, nor with the crumbling of their farmhouse. Instead, it seeped into the soil of North Carolina like a poison, whispered from one generation to the next. Their lives became more than a memory. They became a legend, a chilling cautionary tale that blurred the line between history and myth. Neighbors who once shunned them grew old and told their grandchildren of the cursed house on the edge of town. Some swore they heard cries drifting from the empty fields at night, a child's laughter that curdled into weeping, or the faint lullaby of a woman long dead. Hunters claimed that when the fog rolled heavy across the land, two pale figures could be seen at the windows, gazing out with hollow eyes. Skeptics dismissed these tales as superstition, but the locals knew better. The boy, the lone surviving child, became both proof and prophecy. He grew into a man with a haunted face, his eyes forever carrying the sorrow of his childhood. Though he lived quietly, he could never outrun his past. Employers turned him away, women refused his hand, and children followed him in the streets, chanting cruel rhymes about curses and twins. He bore it silently, never speaking of his mother or aunt, never defending his father, never explaining the truth. Silence became his only shield. Yet silence, too, carries power. Because he spoke little, others spoke for him. Stories grew wild, embroidered with each telling. Some said he was the child of witchcraft, born of sin and sealed by death. Others insisted he carried a mark, a shadow in his eyes, a streak in his hair, a sign of the devil's claim. In taverns and around fires, men told the tale with relish. Two sisters who defied God's law, a man who lost his soul, and a child who bore the price. The stern sister became a figure of fear in the retelling. She was remembered as a woman of iron will, her love so fierce it strangled, her defiance so strong it doomed them all. In some versions, she poisoned her twin out of jealousy. In others, she made a pact with the devil to keep her child alive. The gentle sister, by contrast, became a ghost of sorrow, the weeping twin, said to wander the fields at dusk, searching for the child she lost. Their complexity as living women was lost to time. They became symbols, one of wrath, one of grief. Thomas, the husband, slipped into near myth as well. His name faded, but his role endured. A stranger who brought ruin, a drifter who seduced two sisters into sin. Some tales made him a deceiver, others a victim bewitched by their bond. A few whispered he was not even a man at all, but a demon in disguise, come to claim them and leave only suffering behind. And always at the heart of the legend was the child, the one who survived. His story was never his own. He became a vessel for the community's fear, its judgment, its obsession with punishment. When he finally died, an old man with no wife and no children, the townspeople said the curse had ended with him. But the whispers did not die. They only shifted, transforming into folklore, then into warnings told to children. Do not defy the natural order. Do not bind yourself to forbidden love, or you too may be cursed. Even now, the land bears their ghost. The farmhouse collapsed long ago, the wood rotting into the ground. But travelers who wander too close claim to hear strange sounds in the fields. The rustling of skirts, the whisper of two voices speaking as one, the hollow cry of an infant carried on the wind. Some swear they see a boy's shadow darting between the trees, forever small, forever lost. Historians debate the truth of the tale. Was it truly scandalous sin that doomed them, or simply the cruelty of an unforgiving society? Were they cursed or merely crushed by grief, isolation, and poverty? Records are scarce. The story lingers because it fills the gaps with darkness. Where fact ends, imagination takes over, and imagination is often crueler than truth. In the end, the twin sisters' legacy is not just their tragedy, but the way it was used. Their suffering became a parable wielded against others, especially women, warning them not to stray from the narrow path society demanded. Their love, however flawed, was rewritten as sin. Their grief became a ghost story. Their endurance was erased. What survived was the curse, the shadows, the haunting. Yet if one listens closely, beyond the folklore, beyond the fear, something else emerges. A story of two women bound not just by blood, but by a love so fierce it defied the world. A story of survival against cruelty, of holding on to hope even when the world spat in their faces. Their tragedy is undeniable, but so too is their defiance. Perhaps that is why their story lingers. Not only because of its horrors, but because of its humanity. Today, the legend of the twin sisters remains one of North Carolina's darker tales. It is told in hushed tones, written in old county records and scattered across forgotten cemeteries. Their names may be lost, their faces erased, but their story endures, a shadow stretching across centuries. For in every town, in every family, there is a hunger for tales of sin and punishment, of love and loss, of curses that will not die. And so, the sisters live on, not in flesh, not in the cries of children or the warmth of family, but in the whispers that curl through the trees when night falls. They are the echo in the wind, the flicker at the window, the shadow in the field. They are the warning that choices cannot be unmade, that love can become a weapon, that grief can outlast the grave. The haunting legacy is this, that even in death, they are not free. They remain bound to each other, to the child, to the husband who broke them, and to the land that still remembers. Their tale is not one of peace, but of persistence. And as long as stories are told, the twins will remain, forever watching, forever waiting, forever whispered of in the dark.